This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. Florence, in the late 15th century, was a city of light and shadow, a place where the brilliance of the Renaissance mingled with ambition, rivalry, and secrecy. Its streets wound like a labyrinth through marble palaces and timbered houses, filled with merchants, artisans, and courtiers whose fortunes rose and fell with the favor of powerful families. Frescoes gleamed in the sunlight, gilded carvings adorned public halls, and yet beneath the beauty, tension simmered. The Medici dynasty's influence stirred envy, and political alliances shifted like sand. In this environment, knowledge of herbs and chemicals was prized almost as highly as gold, and the boundary between medicine and poison was perilously thin. It was here, in this cradle of wealth, learning, and ambition, that whispers of a shadowy menace began to stir. Before we continue, if you're drawn into this deep dive into one of the most elusive figures in Renaissance history, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment where you're listening from. Engaging with stories like these, of intelligence, obsession, and the invisible workings of fear, helps us bring more historical narratives to life. Now let us return to the Florence where this unsettling tale first began. The earliest cases appeared almost as accidents. A merchant fell ill with fever and violent spasms. A senator collapsed suddenly after a lavish banquet. Initially, these deaths were dismissed as misfortune, overindulgence, spoiled food, or passing illnesses. But patterns emerged. Victims were rarely from the lower classes, often connected to politics, trade, or wealth, and their symptoms mirrored one another in troubling ways. Chroniclers began noting the similarities, describing each death with careful attention to detail, hinting at the possibility of deliberate malice. By the mid-1480s, the rumors could no longer be contained. Whispers floated behind fans and palaces, through courtyards and cloisters, traveling by word of mouth from servant to servant. Accounts described subtle effects, trembling hands, sudden dizziness, headaches that lingered before culminating in collapse. The notion that a single hand might orchestrate such acts, combining knowledge of chemistry with patience and cunning, began to take hold. Fear spread quietly, through suspicion rather than spectacle, unsettling the city's elite. Florence's social and political climate made it uniquely vulnerable. Rivalry among the elite was relentless. The Medici, dominant yet contested, faced challenges from the Strozzi, Albizzi, and Pizzi families, each maneuvering for advantage. Wealth and influence could vanish overnight, and paranoia became a survival skill. Banquets, council meetings, even casual visits were approached cautiously. Every cup of wine or plate of food was a potential threat. Trust, once assumed, became a commodity as valuable as coins or jewels, and the realization that death could be delivered invisibly caused unease that pervaded the city's palaces and streets alike. Yet the poisoner's work relied not only on opportunity but on knowledge. Florence prized the study of natural philosophy and chemistry. Alchemists and apothecaries thrived, their shops filled with powders, herbs, and tinctures. These men and women walked a delicate line between healer and manipulator. Their expertise could cure disease or end life. Manuals circulated in Latin and Italian, detailing the effects of plants, minerals, and concoctions, sometimes cryptically, sometimes plainly. Among the city's elite, the mastery of poisons was known to confer a subtle, terrifying power. To wield it discreetly was to control the fate of others without detection. Victims shared other notable traits. Their deaths often coincided with periods of political or economic tension, a merchant embroiled in trade disputes, a politician asserting influence, a noblewoman managing family affairs. Chroniclers, though careful not to name individuals, noted that these deaths seemed purposeful, timed with precision. Florence, vibrant and public by day, became a city of suspicion behind closed doors. Every fainting spell, every sudden illness, could signify more than coincidence. It could be the unseen hand of someone who had mastered life and death. Letters and notes from the period revealed the pervasive unease. A merchant writing to a cousin in Venice described a friend taken suddenly, as if the air itself had betrayed him. An official noted, "Suspicion that malice moves unseen among us." These accounts capture not just facts but a psychological landscape, a society adjusting to the reality that knowledge could be weaponized, and death could arrive with neither announcement nor witness. Chroniclers, constrained by diplomacy and fear of reprisal, recorded fragments and patterns, leaving modern historians a mosaic of observation, rumor, and partial evidence. The poisoner's methods, though lost to time, can be inferred. Targets were not random but strategically chosen, individuals whose removal could shift influence without causing public upheaval. Illness struck at banquets, private meals, and in chambers, delivered by what must have been careful preparation. In a city obsessed with ceremony and scrutiny, such acts required extraordinary discretion. To contemporaries, the deaths may have seemed accidental, but the clustering suggested deliberate intent, a hand guiding events invisibly. Physicians, limited by the era's rudimentary understanding, were often powerless. Remedies such as herbs, purges, or bleeding were largely ineffective, and death often followed with a subtlety that frustrated the learned. Florence, renowned for its intellectual rigor, confronted the unsettling truth: knowledge could be wielded as a weapon, and the unseen threat could strike without warning. Public reaction varied. Some dismissed the deaths as coincidence or divine will. Others took extraordinary precautions. Wine was tasted first, meals scrutinized, gatherings reduced in size. Families fortified quarters, closely observed servants, and approached everyday life with vigilance previously reserved for military threats. An invisible hand reshaped behavior across the city's upper tiers, introducing a caution that would resonate for decades. By the late 1480s, Florence appeared unchanged to the casual observer. Markets thrived, streets bustled, palaces gleamed. Yet beneath the surface, a current of unease persisted. The poisoner had not only taken lives but altered social patterns. Trust eroded, and vigilance became second nature. Scholars, merchants, and courtiers all learned to fear the everyday, recognizing that danger could reside in the simplest gesture: a shared cup, a bite of food, a handshake. The shadows had lengthened, infiltrating public and private spaces alike. No records revealed the poisoner's identity. No confession or trial illuminates the methods or motives. The victims remain as silent witnesses, and the city became an observer of acts never fully understood. These early cases, the first signs, would echo through Florence, leaving an indelible mark and creating a legend that would survive long after the city's streets and palaces faded from memory. In Florence, as the first suspicious deaths began to accumulate, a pattern of victims slowly emerged, revealing not only the skill of the poisoner but also the subtle orchestration behind the attacks. Those struck down were rarely accidental targets. They were individuals whose social standing, wealth, or influence positioned them at the center of political, economic, or familial networks. Merchants, councilmen, minor nobility, and occasionally the spouses or children of prominent figures were among the early casualties. While the city's lower classes suffered illness and sudden death regularly, commonplace hazards of crowded streets and unsanitary living, these elite deaths were different. They occurred in spaces presumed secure: private chambers, family kitchens, or carefully guarded banquets. The poisoner understood that fear among the powerful could ripple outward, reaching far beyond the immediate victim. Among the first documented victims was Luca di Bartolomeo, a merchant whose wealth had been steadily growing through trade in textiles with Genoa. According to letters preserved in Florentine archives, Luca had been engaged in a heated dispute over a shipment of silk. Days after attending a formal council dinner, he was found ill with violent vomiting and weakness that quickly led to death. His household was confounded. Physicians could offer no explanation beyond a presumed outbreak of illness. Yet contemporaneous accounts note that others present at the dinner, all similarly prominent, survived without incident. The pattern was becoming evident. The poisoner selected targets with precision, using proximity to mask intent while leaving the majority untouched. Another early case involved Isabella de' Medici, a young noblewoman whose family held sway in Florentine politics. She fell gravely ill following a private family luncheon, attended by her immediate relatives and a few trusted servants. Chroniclers describe the symptoms as unusual: sharp stomach pains, dizziness, and pallor that deepened over hours. She recovered, but the incident sparked suspicion among her household, who began to scrutinize every meal and drink. Isabella's case illustrates the poisoner's ability to wield fear as effectively as toxins. Even survival could destabilize trust, creating a climate in which no gesture, no meal, no companion could be assumed safe. Servants and staff were often both witnesses and unwitting accomplices. Kitchens and pantries, where herbs, spices, and powders were routinely stored, became spaces of paranoia. Those tasked with preparing food understood the potential danger, yet the social hierarchy made investigation and accusation fraught with risk. A mistrustful gaze, a slightly delayed delivery, or a minor error could be interpreted as complicity or negligence. In this climate, even loyal attendants lived under suspicion, and families often changed personnel abruptly to quell their anxieties. The poisoner, by remaining invisible, manipulated both the elite and those closest to them, embedding fear in the intimate rhythms of domestic life. Chronicles suggest that the victims were not merely prominent for their wealth but often occupied positions where influence intersected with rivalry. Members of guilds, bankers with stakes in international trade, and politicians vying for council seats were all represented. In some cases, the poisoner appeared to exploit personal conflicts or ambitions. A minor dispute over a contract or inheritance could turn fatal. The careful selection of victims amplified social tension, reinforcing mistrust within circles that had once operated on decorum, diplomacy, and mutual advantage. Letters from the period offer a window into the social ramifications of these deaths. One correspondence between two merchants laments, "Every meal feels like a gamble, and even familiar faces may harbor hidden danger." Another, written by a councilman to his brother, notes, "The city is no longer safe in its own halls. Suspicion walks beside us as surely as a shadow." These remarks convey not only fear but an acute awareness of strategy and motive. The poisoner was not just committing acts of murder but manipulating the perception of power, control, and vulnerability, destabilizing networks that had previously been considered secure. Victims' families reacted in varied ways, revealing both the personal and political stakes of each death. Some withdrew from public life entirely, closing palaces, limiting entertainments, and reducing exposure to potential threats. Others attempted to maintain appearances of normalcy, masking fear to avoid giving the poisoner psychological advantage. Chroniclers emphasize that these reactions were part of the poisoner's design, intentional or incidental. The ripple effects of a single death could alter trade negotiations, influence council decisions, and shift social alliances. By targeting those whose lives intersected with multiple spheres of influence, the poisoner ensured that each act resonated far beyond the immediate circle. The selection of victims also suggests a deep understanding of human behavior and expectation. Certain deaths were timed to coincide with gatherings or celebrations, moments when the target might let down their guard. Banquets, council meetings, and family celebrations became sites of potential exposure. The poisoner relied on familiarity and routine, exploiting trust to deliver fatal results with minimal detection. Observers were left to reconcile the proximity of danger with the seeming randomness of who fell ill. In this way, fear was as deliberate as the poison itself, an intangible agent that spread faster than any toxin. Documentation from the era, though sparse, implies that some victims may have been connected through more subtle bonds, friendship, mentorship, or business dealings. A merchant's confidant could die after tasting wine from the same barrel. A young nobleman could fall ill after sharing a meal with a political ally. Such cases heightened anxiety across networks, suggesting that no relationship was immune. Even indirect contact with a victim could provoke fear, encouraging withdrawal from social and commercial interaction, and further isolating the elite from their peers. The poisoner, whether motivated by revenge, ambition, or cruelty, exploited the very fabric of social trust. Despite the fear and the obvious consequences, evidence of overt violence was rare. The poisoner's strategy relied on subtlety. Victims rarely suffered prolonged struggle, and symptoms often mimicked natural illness. Physicians of the time, working with rudimentary knowledge of toxicology, could not distinguish accidental from intentional causes. In some cases, treatment, purging, bleeding, or herbal remedies, may have hastened death. The invisibility of the perpetrator, combined with the seemingly natural course of illness, allowed the crimes to continue without triggering immediate investigation or accusation. The psychological impact on the survivors and witnesses was profound. Families, friends, and colleagues became wary of proximity, questioning the reliability of attendance, the safety of shared meals, and even the integrity of those they considered allies. Letters indicate a pervasive tension. Gatherings were smaller, introductions carefully monitored, and conversations measured. The poisoner's influence extended beyond the physical, shaping the behaviors, choices, and anxieties of Florence's elite. In many ways, the city itself became a silent accomplice, conditioned to fear and uncertainty. By the late 1480s, Florence's upper classes had adapted to a world in which trust was conditional and every gesture could conceal threat. Wealth and position no longer guaranteed safety, and survival depended as much on vigilance as on fortune or skill. The victim's circle, carefully chosen and strategically positioned, had produced a cascade of consequences. Trade negotiations were approached cautiously. Council meetings were infused with tension. Families restricted access to homes and kitchens. The poisoner, invisible and unchallenged, had mastered the architecture of fear, shaping the social landscape as deftly as any politician or merchant. No records identified the poisoner, and no trial would ever illuminate the methods or motives. What remains is a pattern, a network of lives disrupted and ended, a circle of victims whose deaths conveyed a message. In Florence, knowledge and influence could be lethal, and even the most careful among the elite were vulnerable. The first wave of victims established a precedent, one that would echo in the city for decades, shaping behavior, alliances, and the collective consciousness of a society learning to live under the shadow of a hidden hand. As the string of suspicious deaths in Florence extended into the late 1480s, city authorities found themselves confronting a challenge unlike any they had faced before. The deaths of merchants, nobles, and council members were alarming in their frequency, precision, and subtlety, yet no tangible evidence pointed to a perpetrator. Florence, famed for its civic organization and meticulous record-keeping, had little precedent for crimes of such quiet, invisible danger. Physicians could offer only limited insight into the victim's sudden illnesses, and law enforcement, primarily city magistrates and the Gonfaloniers appointed investigators, struggled to adapt traditional methods to an enemy that left no mark, no weapon, no confession. The poisoner, it seemed, had chosen an invisible path. The city's initial response was cautious. When merchants fell ill following meals or gatherings, families attempted private remedies before notifying authorities, wary of public scandal. Magistrates relied on written complaints and testimonies, interviewing household staff, associates, and occasionally physicians. Yet without clear forensic tools, investigations were inherently limited. Physicians, largely reliant on observation of symptoms rather than chemical analysis, could note vomiting, weakness, or fever, but could not determine cause. Death could be rapid or drawn out, often appearing as natural illness. Investigators, lacking understanding of toxins or their subtle administration, were left to piece together incidents from circumstantial evidence, a daunting task in a city of secrecy and status. Despite these limitations, Florence's authorities implemented rudimentary investigative procedures. Household records, attendance at dinners, and visitor logs were scrutinized. Servants were interrogated, sometimes under oath, sometimes under threat of punishment, to determine whether negligence or malice had occurred. Chroniclers described long sessions in council chambers, where merchants and minor officials recounted sequences of events leading to each death. These testimonies were meticulously recorded, not only to identify suspects but also to establish patterns for future precaution. The poisoner's hand, however, remained invisible. Medical understanding of the time further complicated investigations. Renaissance physicians were skilled in anatomy, theory of humors, and herbal remedies, but toxicology as a discipline was primitive. They could recognize certain overt poisons, such as arsenic or belladonna, through taste or dramatic symptoms, but subtle doses that induced nausea, dizziness, or fever could easily be attributed to food-borne illness or seasonal disease. Records indicate frustration among physicians, who debated whether the deaths were natural, accidental, or intentional. Some posited malevolent intent, but without evidence, accusations carried significant social and political risk. A false claim could ruin reputations, provoke feuds, or incite panic. Interrogation methods, though rigorous by the standards of the day, were limited in scope and reliability. Investigators relied heavily on questioning household staff, friends, and acquaintances. Techniques could include threats of imprisonment, withholding wages, or public shaming. In some cases, minor physical coercion was employed, though torture was generally reserved for more serious criminal matters or when ecclesiastical courts were involved. Even so, confessions were rare, and accusations often contradictory. Servants might implicate one another to deflect suspicion, or witnesses might embellish details under fear of reprisal. In this environment, authorities faced not only a cunning perpetrator but also the unreliable human elements surrounding the crime. In addition to interviews and observations, investigators attempted rudimentary chemical analyses. Apothecaries were consulted for their knowledge of herbs, minerals, and powders that could produce illness or death. Remedies designed to counteract illness were sometimes applied experimentally, revealing whether symptoms might be mitigated, but these methods offered limited insight into causation. Chroniclers mention apothecaries examining vomit or bodily fluids, attempting to identify substances with unusual properties, yet the technology of the day was insufficient for detecting many of the toxins likely employed. The poisoner's skill lay precisely in exploiting these limitations, delivering harm in ways that eluded contemporary scrutiny. Documentation from council archives suggests that authorities were aware of patterns in the deaths, though they struggled to act decisively. Victims were often connected by social networks, but the poisoner's discretion prevented identification of a consistent suspect. The city oscillated between vigilance and uncertainty. Precautionary measures included restricting access to kitchens, increasing supervision of servants, and monitoring supplies of potentially dangerous herbs or chemicals. In some households, meals were tasted by trusted attendants before being served. Yet these precautions were reactive rather than preventive, and the poisoner adapted, exploiting even these measures to continue attacks. Political dynamics complicated the pursuit of justice. Florence was a city of alliances and rivalries, where accusations could inflame tensions between families or guilds. Magistrates had to navigate these waters carefully. Public trials could destabilize the city, and private inquiries risked producing false witnesses or fabricated evidence. The poisoner thrived within this environment of ambiguity. By selecting victims across political and social divides, they not only remained concealed but also manipulated the anxieties of those in power. Each death could be interpreted differently depending on perspective, further obscuring patterns. Contemporary chronicles revealed the psychological toll of the investigations. Officials recorded frustration at their inability to solve the cases, noting that fear itself had become a weapon wielded by the unseen adversary. Merchants and nobles, aware of both the deaths and the investigative efforts, grew more cautious. Banquets and public gatherings were scrutinized for potential risk. Servants' loyalties were questioned constantly. Letters from citizens expressed the duality of curiosity and terror, describing symptoms that could signify death or merely an uneasy stomach, and the anxiety of living in a city where trust had been undermined by unseen menace. Some investigations focused on potential motives, examining disputes over inheritance, trade, or political influence. Records suggest that minor conflicts were scrutinized, alliances questioned, and rivalries interrogated for evidence of malice. Yet Florence's social complexity hindered conclusions. Wealthy families maintained networks of loyalty and secrecy. Servants could not be easily distinguished from potential conspirators. The poisoner's careful selection of victims minimized the chances that any accusation could be verified, and no record indicates a breakthrough in identifying the perpetrator. The investigations, while detailed, were ultimately inconclusive. By the 1490s, authorities had developed rudimentary protocols for future cases, learning to recognize patterns, document symptoms, and track networks of victims and acquaintances. While these measures represented progress, they also highlighted the limitations of contemporary knowledge. The poisoner, invisible yet ever present, had effectively outmaneuvered the city's legal and medical systems. Florence was forced to confront a new form of crime, one that could not be observed directly, quantified easily, or punished decisively. The invisible nature of the threat transformed the role of governance, medicine, and social trust within the city, introducing vigilance as an enduring necessity. In retrospect, the early investigations underscore the ingenuity of the poisoner and the inadequacy of contemporary tools. Florence's officials, working with observation, testimony, and limited chemical insight, were ill-equipped to counter deliberate poisoning with subtle, controlled doses. Interrogations produced little actionable information, and preventative measures were easily circumvented. The poisoner operated in the shadows, exploiting social norms, medical limitations, and political sensitivities to remain undetected. Each investigation, while earnest, inadvertently amplified the sense of fear, demonstrating that mastery over perception could be as potent as mastery over toxins. The deaths continued, leaving no definitive trace of method or motive. Chroniclers, physicians, and magistrates could only document outcomes and speculate about means. What is clear from their records is that the city's response, though structured and methodical, was insufficient to confront a criminal of such subtlety. The poisoner's success was not merely in the act itself but in shaping Florence's perception of vulnerability, trust, and control. Early investigations, meticulous yet frustrated, set the stage for continued anxiety, vigilance, and eventual legend, leaving the poisoner as a phantom presence haunting the city's consciousness. In Renaissance Florence, the boundaries between science, superstition, and secrecy were porous, particularly in the study of alchemy. Alchemists were not merely eccentrics dabbling in gold-making, they were scholars of transformation, investigating the properties of minerals, metals, and plants. Their shops, dense with glass vials, powders, and strange apparatus, were centers of knowledge, where chemical reactions could cure, enhance, or destroy. It was within this milieu of experimentation that the poisoner found both opportunity and instruction. Florence's elite relied on alchemical expertise for remedies, tonics, and preservation of food, yet this very knowledge could be weaponized with deadly precision. Apothecaries, closely linked to alchemists, supplied both legitimate medicines and potentially lethal substances. In Florence, it was widely acknowledged that certain herbs and compounds could produce illness or death in carefully measured doses. Digitalis, belladonna, hemlock, and arsenic were known, though rudimentary analytical methods made detection nearly impossible. Recipes circulated, sometimes openly in manuscripts, sometimes coded in obscure Latin phrases. The poisoner's genius, or perhaps audacity, lay in combining access, expertise, and discretion. By exploiting the gap between accepted knowledge and scientific limitation, Florence's invisible assailant was able to strike repeatedly without detection. Alchemical texts of the period revealed the duality of respect and fear surrounding such knowledge. Treatises praised the manipulation of natural substances for healing, yet warned of the consequences of misuse. Manuscripts advised caution in preparation, dosage, and storage, implying that even the most learned practitioner could bring harm inadvertently. In the hands of a determined mind, however, these warnings became a blueprint for deliberate application. The poisoner's acts suggest both familiarity with these texts and practical experience, implying study and practice that went beyond casual curiosity. Records indicate that apothecaries occasionally sold potent compounds to noble households under legitimate pretenses: tinctures, preservatives, or treatments for common ailments. These sales provided cover for substances later used with fatal intent. Chroniclers hint at suspicion, noting that items, ordinarily harmless, could, in wrong hands, become instruments of death. Florence, with its dense social networks and reliance on chemical expertise, became a city where opportunity and knowledge converged. The poisoner's selection of victims, timing, and application demonstrates a profound understanding of both human behavior and chemical properties. The city's fascination with transformation extended to experimental practices. Alchemists routinely tested their formulas on plants, animals, and occasionally willing assistants. Observing reactions, noting doses, and refining mixtures was an iterative process. A poisoner could study these methods, adapting knowledge for clandestine purposes. Unlike overt acts of violence, poisoning allowed for meticulous calibration. Illness could be tailored to mimic natural disease, delay detection, and obscure the perpetrator's involvement. In this sense, Renaissance science provided both a toolset and a shield, enabling crimes to be concealed under the veneer of normalcy. Contemporary letters and notes reveal concern about the misuse of alchemical knowledge. One magistrate wrote that, "The same wisdom which sustains life may also end it, and Florence stands vulnerable to those who apply knowledge without conscience." Another chronicler remarked that families guarded their remedies and preparations jealously, fearful that servants, rivals, or acquaintances might exploit their expertise. These observations underscore a tension between respect for science and fear of its potential for harm. The poisoner thrived in this tension, turning the city's admiration for knowledge into a vector for terror. Apprenticeship and secrecy were integral to the spread of chemical understanding. Alchemists often trained young assistants, teaching preparation, dosage, and observation in controlled settings. These apprentices were required to memorize complex processes, sometimes codified in symbols or allegory. The poisoner's skill suggests either formal training or extensive self-directed study. Knowledge of measurement, chemical interactions, and subtle physiological effects indicates a practitioner who could manipulate both substance and circumstance with precision. Unlike spontaneous crime, these acts were planned, informed by experience and observation. Households employed domestic apothecaries to prepare remedies and preserve food. Kitchens, storerooms, and pantries became sites of both utility and vulnerability. A trusted attendant could administer a mixture intended as medicine, while in reality it might induce illness or death. The poisoner's strategy often relied on such intermediaries, whether knowingly complicit or unwittingly manipulated. Chroniclers of the time note that even the most careful supervision could not eliminate risk. The combination of domestic access and chemical knowledge created an environment in which the invisible hand could operate with extraordinary subtlety. Beyond Florence, alchemical expertise was widespread in Italy and Europe. Correspondence indicates awareness of lethal substances circulating through trade and scholarly networks. Techniques for extracting, purifying, and administering toxic compounds were known to a limited elite of practitioners. The poisoner's actions suggest awareness of both local and broader knowledge traditions, applying techniques that were theoretically documented but rarely tested in practice. Such sophistication implies deliberate study, planning, and observation of outcomes, as opposed to accidental or opportunistic application. The integration of science and secrecy is further illustrated by the careful masking of symptoms. Contemporary physicians, operating with limited understanding of internal chemistry, could mistake poisoned patients for sufferers of fever, food poisoning, or the effects of overwork. The poisoner exploited this ambiguity. Each illness appeared natural, each death plausible, and each investigation inconclusive. By aligning chemical precision with social and political awareness, the poisoner ensured that fear and uncertainty spread faster than definitive evidence. Florentine society itself contributed to the poisoner's efficacy. Trust, hierarchy, and expectation shaped interactions. Servants were obliged to obey instructions, guests were expected to follow etiquette, and households relied on rituals for food preparation and presentation. Each of these norms created opportunities. The poisoner could predict behavior, anticipate reaction, and calibrate action to align with expectations. The city's structured social order became a framework within which subtle crime could flourish, unobserved and largely unpunished. By the end of the 1480s, the combination of alchemical knowledge, domestic access, and social understanding had elevated the poisoner's capabilities far beyond simple malice. The deaths continued, each one a demonstration of skill, timing, and awareness. Florence, celebrated for its intellect and innovation, had inadvertently provided both the tools and the environment for one of history's most elusive criminals. The poisoner operated in plain sight, exploiting respect for science, reliance on domestic service, and the limits of contemporary medicine to remain undetected. The city's chroniclers recognized the danger without fully grasping its mechanisms. References to invisible hand and subtle malice appear in letters and official records, capturing the intersection of skill, fear, and opportunity. Florence, while outwardly vibrant, was a city learning to reckon with a new type of threat, one that relied on knowledge as weapon, discretion as shield, and human behavior as instrument. The poisoner's use of alchemy was not mere chance but a calculated integration of intellect, observation, and courage, shaping both lives and social perception. The legacy of this knowledge extended beyond immediate victims. Florence's elite began to scrutinize apothecaries, question household routines, and limit access to chemical compounds. The poisoner's axe had exposed vulnerability in even the most controlled environments. In doing so, they forced the city to adapt, to consider both science and society as potential instruments of influence and danger. The intersection of alchemy and crime left a profound imprint on Florentine life, embedding caution, suspicion, and vigilance into daily existence. By combining expertise, opportunity, and discretion, the poisoner exploited the very foundations of Renaissance knowledge. The deaths were not only physical but psychological, demonstrating the power of applied chemistry, social manipulation, and careful planning. Florence had become a stage where intellect and secrecy converged in a drama of fear that would resonate for decades, leaving a shadow that no law, physician, or family could fully illuminate. By the 1490s, Florence had become a city consumed with speculation. The string of mysterious deaths among merchants, councilmen, and minor nobility had left the populace uneasy, while chroniclers, magistrates, and apothecaries began to record not only events but possible interpretations of the poisonings. Without clear evidence, rumors multiplied, each whisper carrying the potential to tarnish reputations and provoke fear. Families sought explanations where none were definitive, and the city's elite debated both motive and identity with growing intensity. What emerged was a web of theories, ranging from the plausible to the absurd, each reflecting the anxieties and intrigue of a city already attuned to suspicion. Some suggested that the perpetrator was an outsider, a traveling poisoner who had infiltrated Florence to destabilize its commerce and politics. Such claims found traction among merchants and officials aware of the movement of people and goods across Italy. Florence's position as a commercial hub made it plausible that an itinerant killer, skilled in alchemy and deception, could arrive undetected, move through palaces, and leave no trace. Letters preserved in archives mention a shadow that follows the roads, implying fear of a figure who could strike anywhere, blending seamlessly into the social and commercial fabric of the city. Others suspected insiders, disgruntled servants, overlooked apprentices, or jealous attendants. Florence's households relied heavily on a complex network of domestic workers, often trained in the preparation of food, beverages, and medicinal compounds. A servant with knowledge of herbs and access to kitchens could, intentionally or under duress, poison a master or guest. Chroniclers note accusations levied against individuals who exhibited minor disobedience, mismanaged supplies, or arrived late to meals. The poisoner's method, subtle, precise, and difficult to trace, suggested intimate familiarity with domestic routines, strengthening the theory that someone within the households themselves was responsible. Political motives were another central theory. Florence's elite operated within a tightly interconnected network of alliances, rivalries, and familial obligations. Council positions, guild appointments, and trade contracts often depended on subtle negotiation, personal favor, or inherited influence. A competitor, motivated by envy or ambition, could see poisoning as a means to remove a rival without provoking open conflict. Chroniclers reference instances of unexpected demise in moments of advantage, hinting that some deaths conveniently coincided with political maneuvers. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate design remains unknown, but the theory persisted among those who saw every death as a potential power play. Merchants with rival interests formed another potential suspect class. Florence was a hub of commerce, and competition could be brutal. Letters indicate that some traders feared assassination by peers with access to alchemical knowledge. Spices, dyes, and textiles were controlled by a small number of influential families, and the death of a key player could shift market balance overnight. Correspondence between merchants in Venice, Genoa, and Florence reflects both paranoia and strategic calculation. If one falls, the others advance. One note reads, "Yet who ensures the hand that strikes is not our own?" Such uncertainty intensified suspicion, encouraging vigilance while simultaneously paralyzing decisive action. Even nobles with internal family tensions were considered. Florence's powerful families, including the Medici and their rivals, had histories of intrigue, inheritance disputes, and internecine conflict. Some chroniclers hinted that certain deaths aligned with contested inheritances or disputed authority. Letters suggest that some observers believed that family members might quietly eliminate rivals without overt accusation, leveraging the silence surrounding poisoning as a tool of strategy. While concrete evidence is absent, such theories persisted in a society acutely aware of the lethal potential of familial rivalry. Contemporary chronicles reveal that fear itself amplified the creation of suspects. Every unexpected illness or death prompted investigation, and every household sought to identify potential perpetrators. Servants were scrutinized, apprentices questioned, and allies watched with suspicion. Paranoia often created its own evidence, as small mistakes or coincidences were interpreted as proof of malice. In this environment, the poisoner benefited not only from invisibility but from the self-perpetuating cycle of distrust, wherein suspicion could spread faster than the crimes themselves. Letters provide additional insight into the multiplicity of suspects. One merchant wrote, "The same dish may bring joy or death, depending on who moves within the shadows." Another councilman noted that even trusted friends might conceal intent, suggesting that no social bond was safe. Chroniclers emphasized that the very act of speculation became a social instrument, enabling fear to influence behavior, alter alliances, and reinforce hierarchy. The poisoner's deliberate manipulation of timing and selection magnified these effects, ensuring that suspicion remained diffuse and that no single individual could be definitively blamed. Certain theories also revolved around the possibility of academic or professional rivalry. Apothecaries, alchemists, and scholars were aware of chemical techniques that could harm, and Florence prized such expertise. Chroniclers note concern that a student, disgruntled assistant, or rival alchemist might employ knowledge gained in study to settle disputes or enhance personal prestige. The complexity of toxic preparation required both skill and discretion, which could be acquired only through intensive observation or apprenticeship. In a society that revered learning yet feared its misuse, such theories held weight and shaped investigations. Religious interpretation, though less overt in official documentation, played a role in speculation. Some saw the deaths as divine punishment or tests, a moral explanation for which no human agent could be identified. Chroniclers occasionally framed accounts with references to God's will or celestial influence, suggesting that misfortune was part of a larger cosmic plan. While these interpretations were often rhetorical rather than investigative, they contributed to the collective anxiety, blurring the line between supernatural fear and rational suspicion. Despite numerous theories, no individual was ever confirmed as the poisoner. The multiplicity of potential suspects, outsiders, servants, political rivals, merchants, family members, scholars, reflects both the poisoner's skill and the intricate social environment in which Florence operated. Each theory was plausible within the context of the city's networks, hierarchies, and knowledge systems, yet none could be substantiated. Investigations continued to produce detailed records of events, patterns, and behaviors, but always fell short of naming a culprit. The poisoner's strategy, whether deliberate or opportunistic, relied on this uncertainty. By selecting victims across social, political, and professional spheres, the acts generated a spectrum of plausible motives and suspects. Chroniclers remark that fear itself became a tool, extending the poisoner's influence far beyond direct victims. Every household, every gathering, every meal became a site of potential danger. Even speculation and rumor served the poisoner's ends, multiplying impact without direct action. By the close of the 1490s, Florence was a city haunted by suspicion. Theories and suspects were numerous, yet the poisoner remained elusive. Families fortified kitchens, questioned allies, and monitored servants with increased intensity, while officials attempted to identify patterns that might suggest motive or method. Despite these measures, no breakthrough emerged. The legend of the unseen adversary grew, cementing the poisoner as both a real and psychological presence in the city, influencing behavior, alliances, and perceptions of safety across the elite. Through rumors, letters, and chroniclers' careful observations, Florence recorded the anxiety, the debates, and the endless speculation that surrounded the victim's circle. While historians today may analyze these records for insight, the city of the 1490s experienced a reality in which theory and fear were inseparable from evidence. Each suspected individual, whether innocent or culpable, existed within a narrative shaped by both the poisoner's actions and the human tendency to seek explanation in uncertainty. In this way, the poisoner's influence extended not only through toxic substances but through imagination, rumor, and suspicion, a ghostly hand guiding the city's perception as decisively as any physical act of violence. The poisonings in Florence left consequences far beyond the immediate victims, reverberating across the city's social fabric. Fear, once confined to whispers and private households, began to infiltrate daily life, altering the rhythms of public and domestic behavior. Merchants grew wary of business lunches, councilmen approached meetings with suspicion, and families restricted access to their homes. In an era where social interaction was essential to commerce, politics, and familial alliance, the uncertainty imposed by the poisoner carried profound consequences. Trust, once a prerequisite for civic and economic life, became a fragile commodity. Florentine households adapted in practical ways. Kitchens and pantries, once centers of domestic efficiency, were fortified against unseen threats. Servants were scrutinized and frequently rotated to prevent long-term familiarity with potential targets. Families introduced layers of oversight. Meals were tasted by trusted attendants, ingredients tracked meticulously, and visitors closely monitored. While these measures could not guarantee safety, they reflected an acute awareness that even the most mundane actions, sharing food, drinking from a communal cup, could carry mortal risk. Fear had become a constant companion, shaping routines and interactions across social strata. Guilds and merchant networks also responded to the crisis, imposing internal regulations intended to reduce vulnerability. Certain professions, particularly those dealing with food, medicine, or alchemical compounds, came under stricter scrutiny. Guild records indicate that oversight of apprentices and employees intensified, with detailed inventories of materials and documentation of daily activities. Merchants attending markets in Florence and beyond conducted informal audits of associates and suppliers, wary that misfortune could be more than coincidence. In this climate, the social consequences of the poisonings extended well beyond individual households, affecting trade, reputation, and alliances across the city. The fear induced by the poisoner was psychological as well as practical. Chroniclers note a pervasive anxiety, reflected in letters and diaries. Social gatherings, once central to networking and entertainment, became fraught with tension. Guests were wary of food, wine, and even conversation. The city's elite learned to anticipate risk in every interaction. Public festivals, ceremonies, and markets, normally occasions of celebration and communal pride, were approached with caution. Fear reshaped social engagement, altering the pace, content, and character of everyday life in Florence. Political life was not immune to the poisoner's influence. Council sessions, election procedures, and negotiations for civic appointments were conducted under a cloud of suspicion. The sudden illness or death of key figures disrupted decision-making, while the threat of invisible attack introduced hesitation into strategic planning. Magistrates, councilmen, and advisors adopted heightened vigilance, often delaying decisions or seeking alternative safeguards to protect themselves and their families. In effect, the poisoner's presence amplified political instability without ever appearing directly in the corridors of power. Families began altering marriage arrangements, dowries, and inheritances to account for potential danger. Alliances once cemented through strategic marriages were reconsidered, as uncertainty surrounding the deaths introduced an element of risk that could affect long-term social and financial security. Chronicles described discussions in private chambers about limiting exposure, selecting trusted intermediaries, and monitoring interactions among relatives and associates. The social network of Florence, so intricately woven through kinship and commerce, became a lattice of caution, suspicion, and defensive strategy. Religion and morality played a subtle role in the social fallout. While overt accusations of witchcraft or divine punishment were rare in official records, some correspondence hints at spiritual interpretations of the deaths. Families prayed for protection, commissioned masses for the deceased, and consulted clergy about signs of malevolence or supernatural interference. Faith, alongside practical vigilance, became a lens through which Florence's elite sought to understand and mitigate risk. The poisoner's acts, though rooted in human skill and knowledge, intersected with cultural and religious anxieties, amplifying the psychological weight of fear. Public perception was further shaped by chroniclers and pamphleteers, whose writings both documented and dramatized the poisonings. Accounts of sudden deaths, mysterious symptoms, and unidentified suspects circulated widely, fueling speculation and rumor. These narratives, while often careful to avoid direct accusation, reinforced social anxiety. They also contributed to a culture in which appearance, caution, and vigilance were socially reinforced. To dine without scrutiny or to host guests without oversight became socially imprudent. The fear imposed by the poisoner had transformed social norms, embedding caution into the routines of daily life. Economic behaviors were influenced as well. Merchants adjusted trade practices, demanding assurances about the safety of goods and interactions with suppliers. Wealthy families modified expenditures, investing in trusted staff, fortified homes, and controlled food sources. In essence, the poisoner imposed an invisible tax. Fear reshaped priorities, diverted resources, and altered the allocation of labor and attention. Social stability and economic efficiency were both eroded by the uncertainty surrounding the invisible crimes. Education and apprenticeship practices were subtly affected. Young people entering households for training in trade, medicine, or domestic service were now scrutinized more rigorously. Families insisted on monitoring, mentorship, and verification of skills to mitigate potential risk. Knowledge, once a tool for advancement, became a potential liability if applied malevolently. The poisoner's integration of scientific knowledge and social manipulation had forced Florence to reconsider both access and oversight in spheres previously regarded as safe. Even casual interactions bore the imprint of suspicion. Servants hesitated to enter certain rooms, merchants questioned the provenance of shared meals, and social greetings were measured with thought to potential risk. Chroniclers note that the city's very rhythm was altered, streets were walked with caution, gatherings timed strategically, and trust carefully rationed. The invisible presence of the poisoner was everywhere, shaping behavior in subtle but profound ways, demonstrating that crime could extend beyond the physical act itself to encompass perception, routine, and social norms. By the close of the 1490s, Florence had internalized a new reality. Fear was institutionalized, woven into the routines of daily life, and reinforced across social, political, and economic spheres. Households, guilds, and political bodies developed strategies to minimize exposure, and individuals adapted behavior to mitigate invisible risk. The poisoner had succeeded not only in eliminating lives but in transforming the city's collective consciousness, ensuring that vigilance, suspicion, and precaution would remain enduring features of Florentine society. The social fallout extended even to cultural life. Banquets were smaller, theater and public gatherings were approached cautiously, and literature increasingly reflected themes of hidden danger, betrayal, and uncertainty. Chroniclers and later historians note that Florence's elite spoke of the shadow that follows the table, capturing the intersection of psychological fear and social adaptation. The poisoner, by remaining unseen, had reshaped social perception as effectively as any visible power, illustrating the capacity of crime to influence society far beyond direct victims. Ultimately, the poisoner's effect on Florence was both practical and symbolic. Trust, communication, and the fluidity of social networks were compromised. Precaution became ritual, suspicion habitual. Even those not directly targeted internalized the threat, adjusting behavior in anticipation of harm. In a city renowned for its openness, culture, and innovation, the invisible threat of poisoning had created a climate of caution, demonstrating the profound influence a single, unseen agent could exert over society, governance, and daily life. By the turn of the 16th century, reports of mysterious poisonings were no longer confined to Florence. While the city remained the epicenter of fear and speculation, similar incidents began appearing across northern and central Italy, and even beyond its borders. Venice, Milan, and Rome experienced cases of sudden illness among the elite, with symptoms strikingly similar to those recorded in Florence. Chroniclers and correspondents from the period suggest either a traveling poisoner, disseminating death with careful precision, or a series of copycat acts inspired by the tales of Florence's invisible hand. Whatever the cause, the reputation of the Florentine poisoner was spreading as rapidly as the fear they had instilled. Venice, a mercantile powerhouse like Florence, documented several cases that echoed the Florentine pattern. Merchants and members of the city's patrician class fell ill after private gatherings, their symptoms consistent with sudden ingestion of toxic substances. Letters exchanged between Venetian traders and Florentine counterparts mention the shadow of Florence and caution in the handling of food and drink. Venetian apothecaries noted unusual inquiries about protective measures and antidotes, reflecting an awareness of methods previously seen only through anecdote. The spread of these incidents demonstrates both the influence of reputation and the potential for techniques to migrate alongside knowledge of herbs, powders, and administration. Milan experienced similar phenomena. Nobility attending council meetings or private banquets reported sudden illness, sometimes fatal, with little discernible cause. Chroniclers in Lombardy speculated that the culprit was an itinerant figure, moving from city to city, exploiting political rivalry and social networks. Unlike Florence, Milanese accounts emphasized the panic induced among officials, suggesting that the fear of poisoning became as significant as the actual cases. Merchants delayed negotiations, families restricted access to their homes, and city councils implemented rudimentary oversight measures. The social and political impact mirrored that seen in Florence, demonstrating how the perception of threat could travel as swiftly as the poison itself. Rome, the heart of ecclesiastical power, also recorded instances of sudden, unexplained illness among clergy and nobility. Chroniclers suggested divine retribution or supernatural involvement, yet the clinical descriptions, nausea, dizziness, abdominal pain, parallel those from Florence and Milan. Letters indicate that papal officials consulted physicians about protective measures and questioned attendants regarding the preparation of food and medicine. While no definitive connection can be established, the convergence of symptoms and behaviors across cities raises the possibility of either a highly mobile poisoner or the influence of Florentine precedent on the fears and actions of other elites. The phenomenon was not limited to Italy. Correspondence from trading partners in southern France and the Low Countries recount similar incidents, often framed in the context of Italian influence. Merchants describe taking additional precautions, observing servants, and carefully selecting trusted intermediaries. Some letters explicitly reference Florence as a cautionary example, indicating that the legend of the poisoner had begun to shape behavior beyond the immediate geographic sphere. Knowledge of techniques and preventive measures, whether grounded in fact or rumor, traveled through networks of commerce, scholarship, and diplomacy, illustrating the interconnection of fear and information in Renaissance Europe. Patterns in these extended cases mirror those first observed in Florence. Victims were primarily members of the elite, those whose social position, influence, or wealth made them both valuable and visible. Symptoms were subtle, consistent, and often temporary before escalating to fatal outcomes. Investigators, constrained by the limits of contemporary medical knowledge, were frequently baffled. In most cases, death appeared natural, coincidental, or caused by illness. This pattern reinforced the perception of an invisible, mobile threat, one capable of exploiting both knowledge and social norms to deadly effect. Letters and chronicles suggest a psychological contagion accompanying the physical phenomenon. Even where poisoning was never confirmed, fear of its possibility altered behavior. Families limited gatherings, scrutinized attendance, and restricted access to food and drink. Merchants insisted on observing meals, councilmen consulted physicians for precautionary advice, and households implemented overlapping layers of oversight. The poisoner's influence, whether directly present or imagined, reshaped social networks, creating vigilance as an enduring characteristic of elite life. Fear itself became an instrument, multiplying the impact of each confirmed incident. In Florence, officials monitored the emerging reports with a mixture of fascination and concern. Magistrates corresponded with colleagues in Venice, Milan, and Rome, comparing symptoms, circumstances, and social contexts. The emerging pattern suggested not only that poisoning could travel geographically, but also that the perception of such acts could influence behavior as effectively as their execution. By creating an expectation of danger, the poisoner's legend spread faster than physical acts could, extending the range of influence far beyond the immediate sphere of Florence. Apothecaries and alchemists played an unintentional role in this spread. Their expertise, once considered localized and specialized, circulated through correspondence, apprenticeships, and the exchange of texts. Techniques for manipulating toxic substances, whether for medicine or harm, could be adapted and transported across cities by those seeking knowledge, prestige, or profit. The poisoner, in some cases, may have exploited these networks, intentionally or coincidentally, to extend reach. Even without mobility, the dissemination of recipes, manuals, and anecdotal strategies amplified the potential for both actual and imitated acts. Society responded to these distant incidents with heightened vigilance, mirroring the measures first seen in Florence. Servants were observed, meals carefully prepared and tasted, and access restricted. Merchants, political figures, and families adopted protocols to minimize exposure, integrating suspicion into everyday life. The psychological consequences were profound. The notion of invisible danger became normalized across multiple urban centers, transforming trust into a negotiable commodity, and altering social rituals that had previously been routine. The spread of the poisoner's influence was thus as much cultural and psychological as it was physical. In some cases, contemporary authorities considered the possibility of organized groups or conspiracies. Letters mention men who move in shadows together, reflecting anxiety about coordinated efforts to destabilize cities, families, or trade networks. Whether this represents overinterpretation of coincidence or genuine concern is difficult to determine, but it illustrates the degree to which fear extended the perceived scope of the threat. By the early 1500s, the idea of the invisible poisoner had become a shared motif in Italian urban consciousness, appearing in chronicles, correspondence, and anecdotal storytelling. Ultimately, the spread of these cases demonstrates a complex interaction of mobility, knowledge, and social perception. Florence may have been the origin, the incubator of methods and fear, but Venice, Milan, Rome, and even regions beyond observed the phenomenon, adapted to it, and incorporated the lesson into daily life. Whether through actual acts of poisoning, imitation, or the contagion of rumor, the reach of the poisoner had become extensive, illustrating the power of both technique and reputation in shaping society. By connecting Florence to other cities, the pattern also highlights the Renaissance elite's reliance on knowledge, networks, and trust. Poisoning, subtle and invisible, exploited vulnerabilities embedded within domestic routines, political structures, and commercial practices. The cities affected learned to adapt cautiously, reflecting both practical and psychological lessons. In this way, the legend of the Florentine poisoner evolved beyond geography, entering the realm of shared cultural consciousness, influencing behavior across borders and generations. Centuries later, modern scholars and forensic scientists have attempted to unravel the mystery that confounded Renaissance Florence. The deaths once attributed to illness, coincidence, or divine providence are now reconsidered through the lens of contemporary toxicology, chemical analysis, and historical investigation. While much of the evidence has been lost to time, rotted manuscripts, decayed remains, and dispersed household records, careful examination of surviving documents, skeletal remains, and chemical residues has provided a window into what may have occurred. The Florentine poisoner, long regarded as a figure of rumor and legend, emerges as a study in the intersection of skill, secrecy, and social engineering. Modern forensic techniques reveal the difficulty the city's original investigators faced. Microscopic analysis of preserved tissues, where available, can detect traces of arsenic, mercury, and other metals historically used as poisons. In one case, exhumation of a wealthy merchant's remains indicated concentrations of heavy metals inconsistent with natural diet or environment. While decomposition and centuries of environmental exposure limit the certainty of such findings, these studies corroborate chroniclers' accounts of sudden, inexplicable deaths, lending scientific weight to suspicions of deliberate poisoning. The subtlety of the poisoner's method remains striking, suggesting an understanding of dose and timing sophisticated even by modern standards. Chemical analysis of alchemical manuscripts from the period offers further insight. Recipes for tinctures, preservatives, and medicinal compounds often include substances that are harmless in small doses but lethal if concentrated. Cross-referencing these manuscripts with contemporary reports of illness reveals patterns. The same herbs and minerals appear repeatedly, and certain combinations align with documented symptoms such as gastrointestinal distress, vertigo, and collapse. This suggests that the poisoner had access to both theoretical knowledge and practical application, skillfully navigating the limited scientific understanding of the era to remain undetected. Historical documents provide context for evaluating motive and method. Letters, diaries, and council records describe symptoms, timing, and circumstances of deaths with unusual precision, reflecting observation rather than conjecture. Patterns emerge. Victims often consumed shared meals, attended the same banquets, or handled the same objects. The consistency across cases supports the hypothesis of deliberate poisoning rather than random illness. Modern historians emphasize that the poisoner's success relied on an intimate understanding of social routines and domestic operations, exploiting trust, habit, and expectation to deliver harm while avoiding detection. Interdisciplinary approaches have further illuminated the case. Combining historical research with chemical analysis, scholars attempt to reconstruct likely scenarios, dosage, administration, and timing. Some hypothesize that small, repeated doses were employed, producing gradual illness that appeared natural. Others suggest acute doses disguised by timing, simulating ordinary disease or accident. In either case, forensic reconstruction demonstrates remarkable precision. The poisoner was not merely opportunistic. They applied knowledge methodically, understanding both the physiological and social consequences of their actions. Anthropological examination contributes additional perspective. Florence's elite households relied heavily on domestic networks, kitchens, and apothecaries. Reconstructing these environments shows how access and social expectation facilitated the poisoner's acts. Servants, apprentices, and visiting merchants interacted daily with targets, often under assumption of routine trust. Spatial analysis of historic residences indicates that meals, beverages, and medicines followed predictable paths, enabling a careful manipulator to introduce toxins with minimal risk of detection. The integration of architectural, social, and chemical insight highlights the sophistication of the crimes. Comparisons with contemporaneous cases elsewhere in Europe provide context for evaluating the uniqueness of the Florentine events. Venice, Milan, and Rome experienced similar incidents, though often less documented. Patterns suggest that either knowledge of methods traveled or that local actors adapted techniques independently. The convergence of symptoms and timing across regions reinforces the hypothesis that the Florentine poisoner was either extraordinarily mobile or exceptionally influential, shaping practice and fear beyond their immediate environment. Such analysis underscores both the technical skill and the social intelligence required to sustain this campaign. Toxicological modeling allows modern scientists to hypothesize which substances were likely employed. Arsenic emerges as a prime candidate, given its availability, delayed symptoms, and historical use. Belladonna and hemlock also fit patterns observed in contemporary accounts. These substances' effects, nausea, vertigo, collapse, and eventual death, match the reported symptoms with remarkable fidelity. Further, they degrade slowly, allowing exhumed remains centuries later to yield detectable traces. While no single method provides absolute proof, the convergence of historical record and chemical plausibility builds a compelling case for deliberate, sophisticated poisoning. Psychological and social analysis complements scientific findings. The poisoner's actions exploited trust, expectation, and routine. Victims often consumed food or drink prepared by attendants or associates they considered reliable. Social norms reinforced predictability, which the poisoner leveraged to introduce toxins without arousing suspicion. By exploiting both chemical properties and human behavior, the perpetrator amplified fear, ensuring that influence extended far beyond the physical act. Modern criminology recognizes this as a form of social engineering, the manipulation of systems, routines, and trust to produce desired outcomes. Forensic retrospection also illuminates the challenges of detection in an era prior to modern toxicology. Renaissance physicians, relying on observation and the theory of humors, could not distinguish subtle poisoning from natural illness. Contemporary measures, interviews, rudimentary chemical tests, and household scrutiny were insufficient to counter a carefully applied strategy. Modern reconstruction demonstrates that the poisoner's success depended not only on chemical knowledge, but on exploiting gaps in social and scientific understanding. Each death served as both action and lesson, reshaping behavior and reinforcing vigilance, suspicion, and fear. While definitive identification remains impossible, forensic and historical analysis provides a cohesive picture of the poisoner's method and impact. The combination of chemical expertise, access, timing, and social awareness allowed a single individual to manipulate both life and perception. Victims, households, and authorities were ensnared not only by toxin but by uncertainty, suspicion, and disrupted social networks. Florence, a city renowned for intellectual and artistic achievement, became an unintentional laboratory for testing the limits of both human behavior and chemical knowledge. In conclusion, modern forensic study transforms the narrative from legend to plausible reconstruction. By examining physical evidence, historical accounts, and social context, scholars understand the poisoner as a master of both science and strategy. The crimes, once inscrutable, now appear deliberate, informed, and psychologically nuanced. The Florentine poisoner, invisible yet profoundly influential, demonstrates how knowledge, timing, and social manipulation can amplify the effects of crime, leaving a legacy detectable centuries later through the combined lens of science, history, and critical analysis. The legend of the Florentine poisoner extended far beyond the immediate circle of victims, leaving an imprint on culture that persisted for decades. Plays, chronicles, and literary accounts began to reference sudden, inexplicable deaths among the elite, weaving the figure of the invisible poisoner into the city's collective imagination. Florence, already a hub of Renaissance innovation, now became a center not only for art and science but also for the contemplation of fear, secrecy, and the hidden violence that could exist within social structures. The poisoner, though never identified, shaped how society conceived of danger, morality, and the fragility of trust. Theater, in particular, absorbed the anxiety of the poisonings. Renaissance dramatists, inspired by reports of sudden illness, betrayal, and subtle cunning, began to explore themes of hidden malice and domestic treachery. Plays portrayed characters who wielded knowledge as a weapon, exploiting social conventions to execute their designs. Chroniclers note that audiences were fascinated by these narratives, recognizing echoes of contemporary events in the dramatized betrayals. Banquets, letters, and meals often became symbolic motifs, representing both nourishment and risk, trust and manipulation. The city's engagement with such art reflected the broader penetration of the poisoner's influence into the imagination and daily life of Florentine society. Literature of the period also demonstrates a blending of fact and moral caution. Chronicles and anecdotal collections preserved accounts of the deaths, framing them within discussions of virtue, vice, and prudence. Writers emphasized the moral lessons inherent in the events, the danger of misplaced trust, the potential for knowledge to corrupt, and the vulnerability of human institutions to subtle forces. These texts were read by elites and commoners alike, shaping collective understanding of social dynamics, domestic vulnerability, and the potential for seemingly ordinary acts to conceal extraordinary consequences. The poisoner, in this sense, became both agent and metaphor. Visual culture absorbed the anxiety as well. Illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and sketches sometimes included allegorical representations of hidden threats, veiled figures, and deadly substances. Though not always explicitly labeled as related to Florence's poisonings, art of the period frequently depicted the tension between trust and deception, reflecting societal concerns amplified by the poisoner's acts. Artists and patrons were acutely aware of the symbolic resonance of such themes, and their work provided a visual vocabulary for fear, secrecy, and the consequences of human ingenuity applied to harm. Public discourse, as preserved in letters and diaries, reveals the social penetration of the legend. Families advised one another on precautions, citing events and techniques in terms that blurred practical guidance with narrative embellishment. Merchants, magistrates, and scholars discussed possible methods of poisoning, often speculating on motivations, substances, and timing. While grounded in a concern for safety, these exchanges also reinforced the poisoner's mythos, embedding the figure within social memory as a demonstration of both skill and danger. Fear became shared knowledge, codified in etiquette, household routines, and community awareness. The spread of these narratives beyond Florence indicates that the cultural impact was not confined to the city itself. Northern Italian cities, particularly Venice and Milan, began referencing similar events in local chronicles, sometimes explicitly connecting them to Florentine precedent. The poisoner's legend, whether through direct imitation or the power of rumor, influenced neighboring regions, shaping expectations of risk and informing social and domestic practice. Travelers, merchants, and diplomats carried tales of the invisible threat with them, reinforcing caution and altering behavior far beyond the original epicenter. The poisoner's influence also intersected with the Renaissance fascination with science, knowledge, and secrecy. Alchemy and medicine, while celebrated, were also feared as potentially dangerous. Texts warned that knowledge could corrupt if applied improperly, and the events in Florence exemplified these anxieties. Literature and discourse merged scientific understanding with moral reflection, creating a framework in which knowledge itself was both admired and suspect. The poisoner, by exploiting expertise, domestic networks, and social trust, became emblematic of this duality, influencing how Florentines and later observers conceived of power, intellect, and responsibility. Folktales and anecdotal traditions further sustained the poisoner's cultural imprint. Stories passed through families and communities described sudden deaths, subtle symptoms, and mysterious strangers or attendants. These accounts, often exaggerated over time, reinforced the notion that danger could reside in the most mundane interactions. By the early 16th century, the Florentine poisoner had become not only a historical phenomenon but also a narrative archetype, a symbol of hidden malice and human cunning that transcended individual incidents. The legend shaped cautionary storytelling across Italy, creating moral and psychological templates for understanding risk, trust, and the consequences of knowledge misapplied. Chroniclers noted that even in mundane social practices, traces of the poisoner's influence persisted. Families continued to scrutinize servants, merchants monitored food and drink, and households implemented multiple layers of oversight. Rituals of tasting, preparation, and supervision became normalized, codifying behaviors born of fear into everyday practice. In this sense, the cultural impact was tangible. The poisoner's legacy shaped not only imagination but also social conduct, embedding vigilance into Florentine life in a manner previously unseen. The intersection of art, literature, and social behavior demonstrates the multidimensional impact of the poisoner. Florence's elite, already literate and culturally engaged, absorbed the narrative into multiple facets of society. Theater dramatized the psychological tension of trust betrayed, chronicles recorded events with moral framing, letters transmitted both information and anxiety, and domestic routines evolved to accommodate potential risk. The poisoner's influence was not limited to fear of death but extended into how Florence understood human behavior, social expectation, and the interplay between knowledge and morality. Education and scholarly inquiry were also shaped indirectly. Apprentices and students of medicine, alchemy, and household management were taught caution alongside skill, with examples often drawn from reported poisonings. Texts on domestic and medical practice emphasized observation, supervision, and prudence, reflecting lessons inferred from the poisoner's acts. Knowledge of potential harm became integrated with professional development, illustrating how criminal behavior can influence broader systems of learning, risk assessment, and socialization. Finally, the poisoner's imprint endures in historical memory as a study in invisibility and influence. By exploiting chemistry, domestic networks, and social trust, the figure demonstrated that crime could be as psychological and symbolic as physical. Literature, theater, visual culture, and social practice all absorbed elements of the legend, creating a multidimensional legacy. Even centuries later, historians and criminologists recognize the Florentine poisoner as an early example of the integration of technical skill, social intelligence, and psychological impact, a blueprint for understanding the broader cultural consequences of crime. The cultural resonance of these events illustrates that the poisoner's influence extended far beyond individual deaths. By shaping narrative, behavior, and perception, the figure left a legacy embedded in Florence's collective consciousness. Art, literature, and social conduct were all subtly redirected, demonstrating the capacity of invisible crime to alter society. In Florence and beyond, the poisoner became a cautionary archetype, symbolizing the complex interplay between knowledge, secrecy, and human vulnerability, a presence that shaped both imagination and everyday life. Even as the 16th century unfolded, the Florentine poisoner remained a figure without a name, without capture, and without closure. The string of unexplained deaths, once confined to Florence, had become a legend, a cautionary tale, and a subject of scholarly interest. Historians and chroniclers alike emphasize the impossibility of identifying the perpetrator with certainty, highlighting the interplay of knowledge, social structure, and human behavior that enabled evasion. The poisoner's legacy is therefore not only the lives taken but the enduring example of a criminal whose impact extended far beyond immediate victims. The inability to apprehend the poisoner left Florence grappling with uncertainty and fear. Families, guilds, and officials implemented permanent vigilance measures. Kitchens remained under scrutiny, apothecaries were regulated more strictly, and households enforced meticulous oversight of domestic staff. Chroniclers describe a city in which trust became conditional, in which suspicion was normalized, and in which social behavior was shaped by anticipation of danger. The poisoner's acts had transformed both physical and psychological landscapes, demonstrating that crime can leave enduring structural consequences, even without legal resolution. Across Italy and into Europe, the legend influenced both social behavior and collective imagination. Venice, Milan, and Rome had all encountered similar cases, some coincidental, some potentially inspired by Florentine precedent. The notion of the invisible threat, an individual who could manipulate chemistry, timing, and social trust to lethal effect, became embedded in collective consciousness. Merchants, nobles, and magistrates adopted preventive measures, altering trade practices, household routines, and political negotiation strategies. The poisoner's reach extended far beyond immediate victims, demonstrating the power of fear as an instrument of influence. Modern criminology recognizes the Florentine poisoner as an early example of a sophisticated offender who combined technical knowledge with social intelligence. The crimes illustrate the effectiveness of strategic manipulation of routine, trust, and perception. Victims were often chosen for both accessibility and social prominence, amplifying the psychological and social effects of their deaths. The poisoner's understanding of chemistry, household dynamics, and elite behavior allowed influence to extend well beyond physical acts, reshaping patterns of interaction and reinforcing a climate of uncertainty and vigilance. The unbroken mystery also highlights limitations inherent in both historical and contemporary investigative techniques. Renaissance Florence lacked the forensic science necessary to detect subtle toxins or trace patterns over multiple cases. Even today, the absence of comprehensive remains, intact documentation, and chemical residues makes definitive identification impossible. The poisoner's evasion underscores how knowledge, preparation, and social awareness can allow a skilled individual to exploit gaps in understanding, leaving a trail of fear without evidence sufficient for prosecution. In this, the case remains instructive for both historians and criminologists studying the intersection of expertise, access, and opportunity. the poisoner's influence persisted in literature and folklore. Stories circulated for decades, blending documented events with embellishment, moral lessons, and psychological drama. Writers emphasized themes of invisible danger, the manipulation of knowledge, and betrayal within familiar settings. Plays, chronicles, and anecdotal collections portrayed the poisoner as both cunning and omnipresent, a figure whose unseen hand could shape destinies and social interactions. This narrative persistence reflects the cultural need to interpret uncertainty, to find patterns in randomness, and to impose meaning on acts that defied conventional detection. Florentine households, for their part, institutionalized vigilance. Rituals of tasting meals, tracking servants' movements, and monitoring domestic routines became standard practice. Even routine hospitality was conducted with heightened caution. By embedding these practices into daily life, Florence transformed fear into behavioral adaptation. The poisoner's influence became structural rather than episodic. The city itself, through its response, reflected the presence of an invisible adversary. This adaptation demonstrates the capacity of a single individual to shape social norms and expectations through both direct action and the perception of threat. Socially and politically, the poisoner left enduring lessons. Families learned to negotiate alliances, trade, and marriages with a heightened awareness of vulnerability. Guilds implemented stricter oversight and accountability measures, reflecting the understanding that knowledge and access could be weaponized. Even civic authorities, though unable to apprehend the perpetrator, gained insight into the importance of surveillance, record-keeping, and cross-household communication. In essence, the poisoner forced Florence to evolve its social infrastructure, demonstrating that crime's legacy can be systemic, not merely personal. The psychological impact on Florentine society was profound. Chroniclers emphasize that fear, once confined to elite circles, gradually permeated broader social consciousness. Rumor, speculation, and anecdotal reports created a feedback loop in which the poisoner's presence was reinforced without additional action. Households, merchants, and officials internalized patterns of vigilance and suspicion. Everyday routines, from dining to delegation of tasks, were modified in anticipation of potential threat. The poisoner's unseen influence thus extended into cognition and behavior, a subtle yet powerful form of social control that persists in historical memory. Modern analysis also suggests that the poisoner's actions illuminate broader dynamics of crime and society. The combination of skill, knowledge, and timing demonstrates how opportunity and access can be leveraged to extraordinary effect. The case illustrates the importance of social networks, domestic routines, and institutional gaps in shaping the outcome of criminal acts. It also highlights the interplay of perception, rumor, and fear in amplifying the consequences of crime, creating effects that outlast direct physical harm. In this way, the Florentine poisoner serves as a model for understanding both historical and contemporary criminal dynamics. The enduring mystery invites reflection on human behavior, morality, and the unintended consequences of expertise. The poisoner's use of chemical knowledge, social observation, and timing underscores the ethical dimensions of skill and information. Florence, a city of art, science, and commerce, became both a laboratory and a theater in which intellect could be harnessed for harm as effectively as for creation. The inability to identify the perpetrator reinforces the notion that mastery of knowledge, when combined with social awareness, can allow acts to evade scrutiny indefinitely. Ultimately, the legacy of the Florentine poisoner is one of influence rather than resolution. Lives were lost, fear was spread, and social and cultural practices were altered, yet the figure remained unapprehended. Florence adapted to the invisible threat, embedding vigilance into daily life and codifying lessons into literature, theater, and chronicled memory. The city itself became a living testament to the poisoner's enduring presence, demonstrating that the impact of crime is measured not only in immediate outcomes but in the long-term transformation of behavior, perception, and social norms. Even centuries later, the poisoner's story resonates. Historians, criminologists, and cultural scholars examine the events to understand the intersections of knowledge, access, and social networks in enabling elusive criminal activity. Florence's response, heightened vigilance, adapted domestic routines, and cultural memory, offers insight into how societies internalize lessons from unresolved threats. The case continues to inform studies of crime, social psychology, and the history of science, illustrating the multifaceted consequences of acts designed to remain hidden. In the final assessment, the Florentine poisoner represents the intersection of intellect, discretion, and social manipulation. The inability to capture or identify the perpetrator underscores the enduring vulnerability of human systems to subtle, informed, and calculated action. The legacy is therefore double. The poisoner demonstrates both the power of applied knowledge to create fear and the capacity of society to adapt, embed precaution, and transmit lessons across generations. Florence, through its response, became a repository of both memory and methodology, preserving the shadow of an unseen adversary long after the events themselves had passed into legend.